In this limud, we will, Be'ezer Hashem, attempt to learn a familiar sugya in Pesachim, a sugya which discusses the din of simcha on Atzeres, sugya which is often used especially in Sifrei Machshava, Sifrei Avodah, as containing one of the key perspectives of Chazal on the essence of the Yom Tov of Atzeres, the lashon of the Gemara of Hakol Moedim B'Atzeres, the Be'inon Lachem Ma'itayim V'Yom Shenitna B'Torah, in Sifrei Avodah almost encapsulates the essence of what the Avodah Sayoyim of Atzeres is. And Be'ezer Hashem, we will try and be ma'ayin in this sugya and define more precisely the din of Ba'atzeres de Be'inon Lachem. To recap the basic point of the sugya, the Mishnah in Pesachim on Daf Samachei Amud Beis discusses whether or not a Korban Pesach which is brought on Shavuos, where the din is that the malachas involving the Korban Pesach itself, the shchita, the zrikas hadam, etc., the basic parts of the avodas hakorban, the parts necessary for the hakravas hakorban, are deicha Shavuos. The Mishnah then goes on to discuss whether certain malachas derabanan that one may incur in the process of preparing the Korban Pesach are those deicha Shavuos. The Mishnah begins with the svara of Rabbi Eliezer, v'haloi dinhu, should surely be a kal v'chomer, u'ma im shchita shemishum melacha deicha Shavuos. Shchita, which is a melacha deiraisa, Rashi says shchita is listed in the Mishnah in Kal Gadol, Daf Ayin Gimel, is one of the obvious melachos. Elu, those melachos which one may incur in the course of preparing the Korban Pesach, shehin mishum Shavuos, which are only asim midirabanan, lo yidchu es Shavuos. If melacha deiraisa is set aside for Hakravas Pesach, so certainly Shavuos derabanan. To which Rabbi Shua then counters Amalei Rabbi Shua Yom Tov Yechiach. The din of Meleches Eichel Nefesh on Yom Tov itself should be a proof that that principle doesn't always apply. And even in a place where Melacha Doiraisa may be mutter, however, sometimes Chachamim He'emidu Divreim, Chachamim will be Machmir on Shvusim and will asa. What's the raya? Shehitir by Mishum Melacha v'asr by Mishum Shvus. Rashi explains, Melachas Doiraisa, Shchita ubishal, says Rashi, Shu Av Melacha, umutarim lehediet, v'osru boi lahavi dovar michutz latchum ula ochlai. The tchum in Rashi says are derabanan, and yet for the purpose of eichel nefesh, to bring an eichel on Yom Tov, chachamim ased havo michutz latchum. So we have a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua. If there is a svara that in an instance where melacha d'oraisa is set aside for a kiyum mitzvah, does that then automatically imply that melachas derabanan are certainly set aside? Rabbi Eliezer holds it's a kal v'chomer, and Rabbi Shua says we have a raya from the gzeres that Chachamim made in place of meleheter, melechas eichel nefesh on Yom Tov, that principle does not necessarily hold true, and there are occasions in which an issa derabanan may be more chamur and not subject to a tchiyah different to an issa deraisa. To which Rabbi Eliezer counters, Amalei Rabbi Eliezer answered Rabbi Shua, Mazi Yeshua. What is this proof that you're bringing Yeshua? Maraya Rishus Mitzvah. How can you draw a comparison between Rishus and Mitzvah? What does Rabbi Eliezer mean? So the Gemara explains and says on Daf Samach Amud Beis, Rabbi Yeshua L'Taimei, Rabbi Yeshua who brought a proof from Simchas Yom Tov, where Melacha D'Oraisa will be mutter for Eichel Nefesh, but not necessarily Melacha D'Rabanan, for example, Isurim D'Rabanan, for example, Hava Michutz Latchum. Rabbi Yeshua could bring that proof because he holds Simchas Yom Tov Nami Mitzvahi. Whereas, says the Gemara, Rebbe Lezer holds that Simchas Yom Tov is called Rishus. That was the lashon of the Mishnah, my raya Rishus l'mitzvah. So the Gemara goes on to explain there is a basic machlokes between Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yeshua about regarding the din of Simchas Yom Tov. Is there a mitzvah to be oichel v'shoiseh on Yom Tov, or can one be mekayim the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov by alternate means? Now we'll see as we proceed in the Rishonim that Rebbe Lezer never came to say that there is no mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. He just said that in place of fulfilling the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov through achila and shtia, which in the lashon of the Gemara is called the lochem, one can be mekayim through alternate means. In the lashon of the Balamor, the Balamor says that Rebbe Lezer's shita is pirish vafilu the Rebbe Lezer loy nafka mitzvahs Yom Tov michlal simcha michlal mitzvah legamri. Rebbe Lezer never meant to say there's no mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. Elo sheyesh lo chalipin utmura. It can be exchanged and compensated for b'yoshev v'shayne by someone who is Isaac in Talmud Torah. Says the Balamor, lefikach hu koire oisa rishus. That's why Rebbe Lezer considers Simchas Yom Tov through achila v'shtia as rishus, meaning it doesn't have to be. There are other Rishonim that invoke the lashon of the Gemara in Chulin that mitzvah legabe choiva rishus karile. There are three categories of chiyuvim, the Gemara says in Chulin. There's something which is choiva, which means it's something which must be done and cannot in any way be avoided. There's something which is called mitzvah, which means when one does it, one is mekayim a mitzvah. But one doesn't necessarily have to be mekayim the mitzvah in that way. And then there's something called rishus. The Gemara says that there are instances in which the second category, namely mitzvah, is labeled as rishus in order to distinguish it from chayva. Says the Balamor, that's the use of Rebbe Lezer of the term in the Mishnah of Maza Yeshua Marai Rishus LeMitzvah. Rebbe Lezer never meant to say that Simchas Yom Tov is optional. He meant to say that fulfilling Simchas Yom Tov necessarily through Achila V'Shtia doesn't have to be. One can equally provide a chiluf and a tmura, an alternative to Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia by Yoshev V'Shayne. Therefore, Rebbe Lezer held that the reason why Chachamim didn't allow Shavuos or Isurim D'Rabbanan to fulfill Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia is because Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia isn't necessary. One can compensate and replace Achila V'Shtia through Yoshev V'Shayne. And therefore, since Achila V'Shtia on Yom Tov is not Choiva, or in Rebbe Lezer's term, it's Rishus. Therefore, its ability to be Doiche Isurim cannot be compared to Korban Pesach, which is Doiche Isurim, which is a Chayva. There's no way one can avoid Shchitas Korban Pesach. But Mitzvah Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia can be replaced by Yoshev V'Shayne. And therefore, says the Balamor, Rebbe Lezer's argument to Rebbe Yeshua is that one cannot draw a parallel between whether or not the Shavuos of preparing the Korban Pesach would be mutter to the Shavuos of Eichel Nefesh, because the Shavuos of Eichel Nefesh doesn't have to be. It's not of necessity, because Eichel Nefesh can be replaced with Yoshev V'Shayne, with a Chalipin and a Tmura, like the Balamor says. Whereas Korban Pesach is a Chayva. So the Rebbe Lezer's Kal B'Chomer was, in a case of a Chayva, Chachamim would never place a Shavuos in place of preventing a Kiyum Deraisa, because Shchitas Pesach is a Chayva. Whereas in Simchas Yom Tov, where it's merely Rishus, there Rebbe Lezer concedes that Chachamim may well place a Shavuos and prevent Simchas Yom Tov. For example, like Rashi says, not bringing Eichel Nefesh Michutz Latchum. How does Rebbe Lezer counter that? So the Gemara says, because Rebbe Lezer holds that one can never replace Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia with a Chalipin of Tumura, even if one is Yoshev V'Shayne. And this is the basic machlokes which the Gemara sets out. Rebbe Lezer oimer ein le'la'odem b'Yom Tov ela oy oichel v'sheisa oy Yoshev V'Shayne. there's an alternative. Either one can be Eicha B'Sheiseh or Yoshe B'Sheina, one of the two. And as Rabbi Shua holds, no, Chalkeyu Chetzi L'Achila V'Chetzi L'Beis Medrash. One always has to incorporate both Achila B'Shtia and other forms of Simchas Yom Tov, but Achila B'Shtia is never replaceable. So therefore, says the Gemara, Rabbi Shua holds Achila B'Shtia on Yom Tov is Chayva. Rabbi Lezer holds Rishus. So Rabbi Shua's proof from the fact that Chachamim didn't allow certain instances of being over on an Issa D'Rabbanan to be Mekayim Simchas Yom Tov is a proof that in all instances of Chayva, Chachamim may not allow Isurim D'Rabbanan to be over in order to be able to Mekayim Chayva. And Rabbi Lezer has no such proof. Now, there are 2 points which we should touch on briefly. One is made by the Tosfos Rid, and that is, how can Rabbi Lezer say that Achila V'Shtia can be replaced entirely by Yoshe V'Sheina? What happened to the mitzvah of Shalmi Chagiga? There's an Asay Doiraisa to be Oichel Kodshim on Yom Tov. Shalmi Simcha. Besides the din of Oilas Riyah, a person has to bring Shalmi Chagiga, and if he doesn't have enough basa from Shalmi Chagiga, he's mechuyev to bring Shalmi Simcha in order to be able to Mekayim mitzvah Simcha Lidei Achilas Kodshim. That's irrespective of the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. That's a din of the Chayvas Karbanos of the Regel. So the Tosfos Rid says, "Anachanami Avad Rabbi Lezer doesn't mean that one can avoid the Chayva of Achilas Basa," and he discusses that perhaps one. Mm-hmm. So that's mitzvah the din of Simchas Yom Tov, and that Rabbi Lezer holds maybe you can replace. But here we're talking about the Chayva, not just of Achilas Basa, but there's the din of Karbanos. It's a separate mitzvah, not brought by the Rambam in Hilchos Yom Tov, but brought by the Rambam in Hilchos Chagiga, which is that the Yom Tov is Mechayev Karbanos. So that shaila is touched on by the Tosfos Rid. The second shaila is discussed by the Sasemes, and we'll just touch on it because it's important for Pshat in the Gemara, although doesn't directly impact the course of the sugya that will be, as Hashem discuss, and that is when Rabbi Lezer said, "Oy Yoshe V'Sheina, Oy Oichel V'Sheiseh." What did he mean? Did he mean that if one wants to be Mekayim Simchas Yom Tov through Yoshe V'Sheina as a replacement for Achila B'Shtia, does that mean one literally has to be engaged in Limud HaTorah every moment of Yom Tov? Or does it just mean that certainly one can be Mekayim also through Chetziel Hashem and Chetziel Lachem and do both? The Chiddush of Rabbi Lezer is if one wants to, one can even be Oisek in Torah to such an extent that one will never be Oichel V'Sheiseh. What's Rabbi Lezer's basic din? The shita of Rabbi Shua is that one has to incorporate Lachem and Simchas Yom Tov. Rabbi Lezer argues and says there's an alternate form of Simchas Yom Tov, which is called Yoshe V'Sheina. In order to be able to replace Achila V'Shtia through Yoshe V'Sheina, what is Rabbi Lezer's essential chiddush? Is his chiddush that if one wants to replace Achila V'Shtia with Yoshe V'Sheina, one has to literally be Mekayim Kulei LaHashem, and the entire Yom Tov has to be uninterrupted, Yoshe V'Sheina? Or does it just mean one can reduce one's Achila V'Shtia and replace it with Simchas Yom Tov, to the extent that if one would want to, one can entirely avoid Achila V'Shtia? The nafkamina is, would Rabbi Lezer allow Chetziel Hashem and Chetziel Lachem? If one's going to reduce one's Achila on Yom Tov, is it only 100% one or entirely the other, or can one do both? Now the question is, what does Oy mean? Does Oy mean a chiddush that if you want to, you can 100% avoid Achila V'Shtia, but if you want to incorporate some Achila V'Shtia, you don't need to be Yoshe V'Sheina entirely, or is it absolute? So the Sfasema says that Rabbi Seinu HaAchreinim, he doesn't say who they are, assume that according to Rabbi Shua, if one is reducing Simchas Yom Tov of Achila V'Shtia, the alternative has to be Yoshe V'Sheina Kalayim. The concept of Chetziel Hashem and Chetziel Lachem doesn't exist according to Rabbi Lezer. But he says, Lule Divrei Achreinim, he would have said not like that. He would have said that Rabbi Lezer's chiddush only is that if one wants, one can avoid Simchas Yom Tov through Achila V'Shtia entirely, but one doesn't have to. Very basic shayla. The reason why we're mentioning this is because Be'ezer Hashem, when we see later the lashon of the Meiri Meiri's lashon seems to indicate clearly, and I heard this diuk in the Meiri from Meiri Chamish Shlita, that the Meiri is mavur like the achronim that the Sasemes brings. that according to Rabbi Yeshua, if one's going to limit Simchas Yontiv, the only alternative is Kulei Lashem. And we'll come back to this, Be'ez Hashem. So to this point, to summarize what we've seen in the Gemara so far, we have a fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua if fulfilling Simchas Yontiv necessitates Achila V'Shtia or not. Rabbi Yeshua holds being Eichel Nefesh on Yontiv, being Eichel V'Sheisa is Choiva, and Rabbi Yeshua calls it Rishos. The Gemara then goes on to say, Omer Rabbi Elazar, Hakol Moedim, both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua agree that Ba'atzeres the Bu'ino Nami Lochem. Atzeres requires the fulfillment of Lochem, which means the kiyum of Simchas Yontiv, the Pashtus, on Atzeres, requires Achila B'Shtia. Why? This is a very familiar Gemara, as we mentioned, Ma'itayma Yom Shenitna B'Teiru. Says Rashi, Rashi says, the Be'ino Nami Lochem, Sheyismach B'I B'Meichel U'Mishta Laharos Shenoyach U'Mekubel Lo'Imzel Yisrael Shenitna B'Teiru. One has to demonstrate one's simcha at Nesinas HaTorah through Achila B'Shtia, and that cannot be replaced in the Lashon of the Balamor. It cannot be given a chiluf and a tmura through Limud HaTorah. This states in the Gemara. Noach means, as we'll see, Be'ez Hashem, as we go on, Rabbeinu David elaborates on Rashi to say that he doesn't regard Torah as an oil. Oil means an imposition. And Noach Loi means something which is pleasurable. And we'll come back to this lashon of Rabbeinu David in the chelik of the Agada of the Shir Belinei. Now, so this is the Teichen Hasugya. A general machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua in Simchas Yontif, in any Yontif. Atzeres, Rabbi Eliezer is moide the Be'ino Nami Lochem, and one has to be mekayim Simchas Yontif al yedei Achil B'Shtia. Now, seemingly, this statement of the Gemara of Hakol Moedim de Be'ino Nami Lochem Yom Shenitna B'Torah is a chiddush in Rabbi Eliezer. Ordinarily, Rabbi Eliezer says that Achila B'Shtia can be compensated for by Yoshev V'Shaina, and Shavuos that can't take place. L'fi Rabbi Yeshua, seemingly, it should have no nafkamina, because any yontif Rabbi Eliezer holds Achila B'Shtia is unavoidable. Now, we'll come back to see when we discuss the Chasam Sofer and Teisus and Masal Hakol Moedim, we will see that there are Rishonim that hold that even according to Yeshua, who the halacha follows, as the Rambam Paskins in the Chos Yontif, there is also a nafkamina in the chiyuv of Hakol Moedim de Be'ino Lochem, and that is that whereas Tainis Chaloim on a Yontif ordinarily overrides Chayva Simcha, on Atzeres it can't. Because one must fulfill Simchas Yontiv V'Ayidei Achila B'Shtia, and Tainis Chaloim, which is a fulfillment of Simcha because it calms the person from his concern about the Chaloim, Chas V'Shalom, cannot be compensated for, cannot be done on Atzeres. And we'll come back to that. We'll begin with a record of the minig of the Goin on Shavuos. In Teisus Masei Rav, those are additional notes to the Sefer Masei Rav, which is printed in the Siach Yitzchak Siddur. There is a kuntres called Tosefes Masei Rav, additions, addendums to Masei Rav. And in Teisus Masei Rav, the Goin says as follows. It's the Talmud Talmidei of the Gra writing. U'ma'oid somach Rabbeinu Zal b'Shavuos, v'tigdaloi hasimcha yoiser mikol regel. The Goin had a greater degree of simcha on Shavuos than any other Shalosh Regalim. V'olaz liboy, and his heart was delighted, his heart was joyful. B'simchas matan Torah. Now, what it says in this Teisus Masei Rav is that the Gra added a degree of simcha to Chag HaShavuos, a greater expression of simcha than on all other regalim, and the Masei Rav describes herech b'shulchanoi, b'machal b'mishta u'shmachim. His suda was more elaborate, more extensive than on any other regalim. Now, clearly, the Teisus Masei Rav is saying, and that's what he's alluding to in his lashon, that the Gra was fulfilling by enhancing and augmenting the simcha of Shavuos. He was fulfilling this din of the Gemara about Atzeres Bo'ino Nami Lochem. That's what distinguishes Atzeres from any other yontif. And therefore, the Gra says, "Vatigdol simcha yosim mikoregel v'olaz liboy b'simchas haTorah." Where's the source of having to be someach in simchas haTorah? like we brought from the Lashon of Rashi before. Hakol moedim ba'atzeres b'in lachem yom shenitna b'Torah sheyismach b'machal u'mishte lahara shenoichem u'kubel ezel l'sol shenitna Torah b'ay. And therefore the Gra similarly was marich b'shulchanoi b'machal u'b'mishte. The Taisus HaRav is paraphrasing this Rashi as an explanation of the Goin's minig. And therefore, tigdol simcha yosim ikaregel ba'atzeres hakol moedim d'b'in onami lachem. Now, the obvious kasha on this Gra is, as we said before, that the Gemara says that Atzeres is different than any other regal that requires lochem wasn't to therefore necessitate a greater degree of Simchas Yontif. It was merely to equate Atzeres according to Rabbi Eliezer to every regal according to Rabbi Yeshua. Whereas in every other regal there's a machloikes, if Ma'achol Umeshte can be replaced by Limud HaTorah, can it have a Chalipin and Tmura? In the case of Shavuos, it can't be. So that just merely just then created a parallel between and an equality between Rabbi Eliezer on Shavuos and Rabbi Yeshua on any other regel. And we said the only nafkamina l'chura that we know of, according to Rabbi Yeshua, which is how we pass in, is just in the din of Tanis Chalaim. But nowhere in the Gemara does it say, in the straightforward reading of the Gemara, that Shavuos requires an additional degree of simcha because of Yom Shenitna b'Torah. It just says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's inevitable to be Mekayim, and one must be Mekayim et Adechil B'Shtir, Lahara Shanoy Achloi. But according to Bishua, there's no nafkamina. So we're left with a kasha on the Gra, that how did the Gra see in the Gemara that the Simcha of Matan Torah is Mechayev, a Simcha to a greater degree than the Simcha of all other regalim? The straightforward reading of the Gemara is that the Lochem that Rabbi Yeshua requires in every Yontif, Rabbi Eliezer agrees to and concedes by Chag HaShavuos. But Rabbi Yeshua's din wasn't changed. This is the Tzarachian on the Gra. So Remeir Soloveitchik, the son of the Biskirov, in his Chumash Yurim, printed recently in a sefer called Mishnah Rabbeinu Meir Alevi, which is taken from the notes of a Talmud. Remeir makes a tzushtal. Remeir references a dover nifla that's mavur in the Rambam. And Remeir establishes that Eino Chenami, when the Gemara says Hakol Moedim Ba'atzeres Tebu'ino Nami Lochem, the Gemara means like this. The reason why Rabbi Eliezer concedes that on Yom Tov Meichel Nishta is necessary is not because the Chiv of Simchas Yom Tov on Shavuos requires Lochem. What the Gemara means to say is Shavuos has an additional Mechayev of Simcha, which is nothing to do with the general principle that's Mechayev Simchas Yom Tov by all regel, because there Rabbi Yeshua says, Rabbi Eliezer holds that a general Simchas Yom Tov can be compensated for by Yosef V'Shoineh. What the Gemara means to say is there is an entirely distinct Mechayev of Simcha, which isn't part of the Chiv of Simchas Yom Tov. The Yom Matan Torah itself generates an independent Chiv of Simcha, irrespective of the Chiv of Simcha that Atzeres is as one of the regalim. In other words, the Gemara is discussing two issues. One is Atzeres as one of the Gimel regalim. What does its Chiv of Lochem necessitate? In that, says Reb Meir, Rabbi Eliezer still holds that the Lochem of Atzeres is the same as any other regal. What the Gemara is saying is because it's the Yom Shenitna b'Torah, Matan Torah is a new Mechayev of Simcha, a distinct and independent Mechayev of Simcha. Where do we see this? Says Reb Meir, the Sisoid is Mavur in a Ramban at the end of Parshas Mishpatim. Where at the end of Parshas Mishpatim, the Torah describes the Seder of Matan Torah, and on the pasuk of Vayoichlu Vayishtu, says the Ramban, V'tam Vayishtu. What was the reason why Klal Yisrael were oisek in shtia? Says the Ramban, she'osu simcha v'yom tov. That Klal Yisrael made a simcha v'yom tov. Ki kein choiva lismoyach beKabbalah Satayra. Kabbalah Satayra itself is mechayev simcha. Where do we see this? Says the Ramban. Kasher tziva, like the Rebbeinu Shalom, was mitzaveh b'kosvam kol divrei Torah al havonim. Later by Har Grizim and Har Evo, where they had the din to write Kol HaTorah Kula Al Gabe Avonim, and there the Torah says that when they reach HaRav and HaRav, it says, V'zovachta shlomim v'chalta sham, v'somachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Wasn't Yontif, it was Chol. It was the day that they would be Nichnas Labris of HaRav and HaRav. Elu Yamdu, the Or and the Baruch. Where does there come an inyan of V'zovachta shlomim v'chalta sham v'somachta? Where's that from? Says the Ramban, Vibalt, this was another aspect of Kabbalas Torah. Memela, says the Ramban, that was Mechayiv Simcha. So we see, says the Ramban, that in the same way as later in the Seder of the Ksiva of Al Torah Al Gabi Avonim, that was Mechayiv Zvicha Shlomim and Simcha Lifnei Hashem, so too that was the Vayoichlu Vayishtu that Klal Yisrael engaged in after Matan Torah. Why? Because Choyva Lismoyach beKabbalas HaTorah. There's a Chi of Simcha, Kabbalas HaTorah itself necessitates it.
Why was there not such a Chi of Simcha at Har Sinai itself? All the Torah was given at Har Sinai. Why was it after the Ksiva?
It was. Klal Yisrael will Mekayim Vayoichlu Vayishtu now. That's what the Ramban is saying.
Why tie to the Ksiva to the Avonim? Why not when I come first and next
They did. That was a Vayoichlu Vayishtu Kabbalas HaTorah, the Ramban says. Hagufa. Tam Vayishtu, says the Ramban. When's the Vayishtu? The Vayishtu means the Vayishtu by Matan Torah. She'osu Simcha v'yontif. La'achar Kabbalas HaTorah, Klal Yisrael made Simcha v'yontif. The Zvicha of the Karbanas, and that's totally on the Sugin Chagiga, if they were Eilas or Shlomim. But the Vayoichlu Vayishtu, whether it was from Karbanas or additional Achil V'Shtiyah, says the Ramban, Kikin Choyva L'Smayach b'Kabbalas HaTorah. Says Reb Meir, Oiba Zaynifla. The Ramban is mevur that there is a din d'oraisa, irrespective of Yontif. This man of Ksivas Torah Al Gabi Avonim wasn't related in any way to Yontif. Still, that was Mechayev Ochalta Sham V'Samachta Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Matan Torah was similarly Mechayev such a chiv, again irrespective of Yontif. Memela says Reb Meir. When the Gemara in Pesachim says that there's a chiv simcha of Yom Shenina by Torah, that chiv simcha is not machmas, the din of V'Samachta B'Chagecha. It's not the mechayiv of Simchas Yom Tov. That of other Rebbe Lezer holds that chiv can be compensated for by limud, and that's not different by Atzeres. What does the Gemara mean? The Gemara means the reason why Rebbe Lezer is mechayiv simcha al yidei achila b'shti on Yom Tov is because there is a chiv to be someach b'Kabbalas HaTorah. Mimele. The Goyin would then be saying the following: according to Rabbi Yeshua, who doesn't argue with that statement of Rebbe Lezer. The Gemara's lashon is, like you said before, like you pointed out, Hakol moedim na milochem. Hakol means Rabbi Yeshua concedes that. And we said the nafkimina l'didan in the poskim is the din of tanis chaloim, which means fundamentally Rabbi Yeshua agrees that there is an additional svara deraisa and a mechayiv of simchas yontif machmas matan Torah itself. Mimele, the Goyin held that with one achila v'shtia, one cannot be mekayim both smachos. One achila v'shtia is necessary for the kiyum of simchas yontif, and then the chiyuv to be someach ben Kabbalas HaTorah is mechayiv an additional achila v'shtia as a separate demonstration and kiyum of the simcha b'Kabbalas HaTorah. Now, it's important to emphasize. One could say one suda should be oila lekanu lekan. Once one's involved in achila v'shtia, let this be the simcha of both yontif and Kabbalas HaTorah. That's the chiddush of the Gra, that in order to be mekayim the din of the Gemara of choyva l'smoach b'Kabbalas HaTorah, as Rameir explains from the Ramban, that requires additional achila v'shtia. That's the Gra's chiddush. But now we have a way to read the Gemara. Let's go back to the question. We asked that why was the Gra's minig to augment simchas Yom Tov on Shavuos? The Gemara never says one has to add a degree of simchas Yom Tov. The Gemara just says that Rebbe Lezer concedes that there's a chi of simchas Yom Tov through achila v'shtia. But the way Reb Meir is now bringing from the Ramban, the Gra is nifla. The Ramban is saying that Kabbalas HaTorah is mechayiv choyva simcha in addition to Yom Tov. Haraya, the avonim of HaGrizim, Zman Ksivas HaTorah on the HaGrizim and HaRav. Now the Gra is being mechadish that to fulfill that choyva simcha requires additional ma'isa simcha. Memele, the Gra was ma'isif in Michael Mishnah. Nifla. This is the beer of Reb Meir in this Gra, and the raya is from this Ramban. And he says, "V'hainu kamuvur." The explanation of the Goyin is as we've explained. The yesh mechayev miyucha, there is specific and distinct obligation to simcha ala Torah, the simcha zu yiseri, mikol simchas yontif, and that the Gra held is mechayev, an additional degree of simcha different than any yontif. Adkan is the beer of Rameir in this Gra. What we'll now try and see, and according to the Ramban, this is a din deraisa. This is a din deraisa. Why it's a prat kanira in Chayvas Hayom. Why it wouldn't be known as a separate mitzvah? We can be done, but that's what Rameir establishes from this. What we'll now try and do briefly, Be'ezer Hashem, is to try and see based on the Rishonim in the sugya, how is there support for this chiddush that Reb Meir brings from the Gra and finds a mekarfo in the Ramban? Did the Rishonim understand the Gemara when the Gemara says Hakamodim that says B'nai Chaim? Did the Rishonim understand it in similar ways to the Ramban, or did the Rishonim understand it in a different way to the Ramban? We'll begin with Tosfos. Tosfos, the B'nai Hakamodim Batzeres. Now we'll recall, just to go back again to the shorish of this Gemara, that the Gemara sets out the machloikes between Rebbe Eliezer and Rebbe Shua. If Simchas Yontif in Achila B'Shtia is Rishus or Chayva, in order to explain the argument as to whether Oichel Nefesh, which is matter d'oraisas but not necessarily matter isurim d'rabbanon, is that a proof to a general principle that we can have instances in which a isurim d'oraisa are nidche but not isurim d'rabbanon. Rabbi Shua attempted to prove from the limitations that Chazal placed on melacha for Simchas Yontif that we see that there are instances in which melachas d'oraisa are mutar but melachas d'rabbanon are not. Rabbi Shua was doiche, Rabbi Eliezer was doiche, and he said you can't compare rishus l'mitzvah. Chayvas achila b'shtia Yontif, oichal nefesh is rishus. Tosfos asks a kasha, tema l'riva. If now we've established that on Atzeres, on Shavuos, Rebbe Eliezer concedes that there's a chayvas achila b'shtia, so says the Riva, let's now look at the heter of Oichel Nefesh, narrowly focused on Atzeres, just Atzeres. Do we find any kula that on Atzeres, melochas d'rabbanon are mutar for Oichel Nefesh? Do we find that kula? We don't find that kula. There's no evidence in the sugyas that on the Yontif of Atzeres, Chazal were ever makel in melachas of Oichel Nefesh. We don't find such a thing. So Tosfos asks the Riva, so Rabbi Yeshua has a proof that Rabbi Eliezer has to concede to. Why? Rabbi Yeshua proved from every Yontif melachas d'oraisa are mutar, but Chazal nonetheless asked to bring Oichel Nefesh chutz latchum, for example. So therefore, Rabbi Yeshua says, you see, melachas d'oraisa mutar, melachas d'rabbanon not. Rabbi Eliezer says, Oichel Nefesh is different. Can't be doiche. Why? It's rishus. Riva, I'll show you a case where even according to Rebbe Eliezer, achila v'shtia is going to be a chayva, and nonetheless chachamim will still machmer. What's that? That's Atzeres. Every Shavuos. In Shulchan Aruch, does it say any kula in Oichel Nefesh on Shavuos? No. All isurim d'rabbanon were kept in place. So I have a proof. Rebbe Eliezer's Simchas Yontif on Atzeres is Rabbi Shua's Simchas Yontif on Sukkos. The only argument Rebbe Eliezer can make to dismiss Rabbi Shua's proof is Rabbi Shua, is Yeshua. Mara Yisur Rishus l'mitzvah. How can you compare Rishus to mitzvah? On Atzeres, Rebbe Eliezer also holds it's mitzvah. So we have a proof. Let Rabbi Shua counter to Rebbe Eliezer from Atzeres. You have to be moided to me that on Atzeres Oichel Nefesh is the chiyuv. And nonetheless, Chachamim was still minding the Divrei. You can't bring Oichel Chutz Latchum on Shavuos any more than you can on Sukkos and Pesach. So why couldn't Rabbi Shua counter Rebbe Eliezer with a proof that he himself has to concede? Zok Tosfos, the answer is, V'yesh loymar, deho deboy Rebbe Eliezer b'atzeres lochem lav dafka mikro el misvar. There's no makar in Torah for this din of Yom Shin and Avei Torah. Gemara doesn't bring any psukim. So what is it? It's a svar. So the Riva, if it's a svar, Rabbi Shua can't prove against Rebbe Eliezer. Fake the Chasam Sofer. Why not? The svar is a svar d'oraisa. It's a deraisa. Yom Shenina by Torah, even if the Gemara doesn't bring a proof, but the Gemara clearly holds it's a svar deraisa. So does it make a difference if it's a gzes hakosov or a svar? The deraisa is still in place, that there's a choyvas, achila, v'shtia, on atzeres, deraisa according to Rebbe Lezer. And still, chachamim u'mayim midivreim. No, what did Taisa's answer? So the Chasam Sofer in Chidush Sugya says a dover nifla. He says, very bekitzer, he says, Rotzoloimar, what does the Riva mean to say? Svara derabonon. The Gemara never meant like it's a deraisa. Yom Shenin about Torah, the Gemara doesn't make proof for a pasuk. Then derabonon. Chachamim said it. Now, and the Chasam Sofer is not so schwer, because the Gemara goes on to say that there are other days that Rebbe Lezer concedes lachem. What are those days? The Gemara says, Shabbos ba'inon lachem, karas ala Shabbos oineg, Purim ba'inon nami lachem, yom mishta v'simcha ksiv. So we see the Gemara is not just talking about deraisas. Oineg Shabbos, according to most Rishonim, it's not a din deraisa. It's a shita sayireim that it's a din deraisa. Pashtus, it's at most a mitzvah midivir Kabbalah. So to Purim is not a deraisa. So Zot the Chasam Sofer, Kuli Yom Moed Yom Shinin No B'Torah is also derabanan, because there's no proof in the pasuk. The Gemara doesn't bring it. So derabanan. That's the Chiddush of the Chasam Sofer. Now with that, and we'll just touch on this briefly. The Chasam Sofer with that answers a nifla, a kash of the Magen Avraham. We'll just touch on this briefly. We had mentioned before that there are Rishonim that say that the nafkemina of Atzeres having an enhanced din simcha, so to speak, is that one cannot be misaneh tanis chaloim on Atzeres. The Magen Avraham in Hilchos Yom Kippurim, in the beginning of Siman Tofreish Daled, asks the following kasha. He says the Ramah in Hilchos Erev Yom Kippurim says that on Erev Yom Kippurim, because there's a mitzvah to be oichel, one cannot be misaneh tanis chaloim on Erev Yom Kippurim. That's based on the Gemara in Pesachim later, that there's the Isser of Tainus on Erev Yom Kippurim, because there's a mitzvah of Achila V'Shtia. So Magen Avraham asks, if that's true, why doesn't the Ramah bring in the halachas of Shavuos that one cannot fast the Tanis Chaloim on Shavuos? It's the same sugi. It says, you don't find it. It's not muskar in the place, it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah doesn't bring it, it's not brought. The Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos in Shavuos brings this Magen Avraham. And he says, Le'inyan Tainus Chaloim B'Shavuos Ein Magen Avraham, Siman Tofreish Dal. In fact, the later Achreinim post Mishnah Berurah ask that, what does Mishnah Berurah mean? The Magen Avraham doesn't say what the din is. He just asks why the din isn't brought. Magen Avraham doesn't say what one should do or shouldn't do. But okay, halacha l'maisa, we'll leave that shaila. But says the Chasam Sofer, I'll explain why. Because, says the Chasam Sofer, there's a difference between Erev Yom Kippurim and Shavuos. What's the difference? Erev Yom Kippur is a gzes hakosov that you have to eat. According to many Rishonim, it's a din deraisa. It's a deraisa. So therefore, says the Chasam Sofer, since it's a machloikis Rishonim, whether or not one can extrapolate from this Gemara and say that Atanis Chaloim is osir on these days that the Gemara lists. So on your Erev Yom Kippurim, which is a deraisa, we have to go to Chumrah. But Shavuos, which is a derabanan, one can go l'kula. And therefore the Ramah was only machriya and issa tainis chaloim on Erev Yom Kippurim, because there the chiyav achila v'shtia is deraisa. Masha'enken on Shavuos, says a Chasam Sofer, where Taisis Muvur, it's only a chiyav derabanan. Mimela, if it's only a chiyav derabanan, so the Magen Avraham paskin la'akol. And since it's a machloikes rishonim, whether or not this additional din of simcha on atzeres asas tanis chaloim, so therefore the Ramah was machriya l'kula. That is the Chasam Sofer's yishuv nifla to this kasha of the Magen Avraham. What do we see though in this thesis, the way the Chasam Sofer understands? That we see l'chayra another smach to the way Rameh learned the Gemara. That there is no makor that hakol moedin v'atzeres bin lachem yom shenitna b'Torah is a din related to the mitzvah of Simchas Yom Tov. It's not. It's a din derabanan that Chachamim required, Simchas Yom Tov. It's not related to the din deraisa lachem. It's not related to the pasuk. No connection whatsoever to the pasuk. One can only establish that certain dinim become integral an integral part of Simchas Yontif and Lochem if they have a makar in the pasuk. But once they don't have a makar in the pasuk, it's just a takana d'Rabbanan. Mimele. We can go back to the Gra and say that even if we don't resort to the chiddush of the Ramban that Rav Meir showed, that Simchas Yontif is mechayev midor, at Kabbalas Torah is mechayev midoraisa a yochel v'yishtu. But Rabbi Shua also agrees to Rabbi Lezer that there's a takana d'Rabbanan to be yochel v'sheisa on Atzeres. There's no machlokes about that. But Atzeres hakol noyedim to be inon lachem. Says the Chasim Sofer, the Riva says it's a takana d'Rabbanan to be yochel v'sheisa. So again, we have a possible approach to the Gra. That besides the chiyuv d'oraisa of lochem, we also have a chiyuv d'Rabbanan to be oicha b'sheisa as a specific chiyuv of yom shenitna by Torah. So again, we have a yushuv to the Gra. So we have support for Reb Meir's svara that which the Gemara establishes that anatzeres hakomodim debinan lochem is not an aspect of Simchas Yontif, because then there will be no difference to the didan. But it's an additional chiyuv, which the Chasim Sofer says is a takana d'Rabbanan. The Yesod Hadvarim, we find actually mefurish in the Balamor. The Balamor, at the end of his Arichos on the Sugya, asks the same question as the Riva, namely, why didn't Rabbi Shua counter Rabbi Lezer's proof by invoking the din of Atzeres and saying that on Atzeres, Achila v'shtia is a chiyuv, and nonetheless Chachamim still didn't allow Isurim d'Rabbanan. Zok the Balamor, what do we see from there? He says, the Atzeres nami lekel mifrach. One can't ask from Atzeres. Afal gab damir hakol moedim beyond Tosh Atzeres b'inen achem. Says the Balamor, hahi loi mitzvah min haTorah. It's not a mitzvah min haTorah. Elo mailohu the ovud Rabbanon k'de yoev lehu taima yom shenitna b'Torah. It's the gzera de Rabbanon. Says the Balamor, if this would have a makar in the deraisa, so why does Chacham have to say a svara? Bring whatever the makar deraisa is. Al karachach, there is no makar, and this is a takana d'Rabbanan. As ich state mefurish in Balamor. So we have again what the Chasim Sofer is mechadash b'shittas haTosfos. We similarly have mefurish in the Balamor. And the same din we find in Rabbeinu David, Talmud HaRamban. Rabbeinu David, Talmud HaRamban in Masechta Pesachim. He says, "Hakol moedim de bi'an atzeres nami lochem yom shenitna b'Torah." Says Rabbeinu David, it's not possible to explain midin hakosuf, that this is a din deraisa. We don't find that in any place the Gzeres HaKosov discussing Simchas Yontif in any way implies that there's a distinction between Simchas Yontif on Shavuos and Simchas Yontif on other Yom Tovim. It's a takana d'Rabbanan. Shahakol chayovim nismoyach b'yom shenitna b'Torah k'dei liris esatzmei shu someach b'matan Torah, and this is what we mentioned before. Ve'enoi olav ka'oil al tzavare. And he concludes Rabbeinu David at the end of his Arichos, and he says, "Va'af b'yom matan Torahu k'dei liris atzmei someach b'matnas haTorah. Aval ein hoida osay shor b'leza b'atzeres min hakosuf." And he says the same proof as the Balamor. Rishua should have brought a proof from Atzeres.
Here we have Chachamim telling us to be Makabel O Torah, not versus Torah O Torah, then other things will happen. So it's important to have an O.
Correct. This is an excellent question. What is the role of oil and what's not the role of oil? We may be able, if time allows, to touch on that in the Agoda section of the Limud. But the question is really a question that the Rishonim discussed based on a Gemara. That we see at the same time as Klal Yisrael had to Makabel Torah b'Rotzanai Din Asav and Nishma, it required Kfiyah of Kfiyas Harkegigis also. So Matan Torah itself, as the Maharal points out at length in the beginning of his Pirush on Megillas Esther and Pirush Ar-Chodosh, contains both these elements. It contains both an element of Rotzon, of absolute Matana, and an element of Oil and Kfiyah. And this is something which is fundamental to the bris of Torah, and it is something which requires a elaboration, and perhaps B'nai will try and get to it.
More question. We find elsewhere Chachamim Dafka going out of their way to be Misakin Simcha, like here.
Yeah, so that we have in the Hemshech of the Gemara. We have it possibly by Shabbos, we have it by Purim, and there are other instances also. Yes. So this wouldn't be an exception. So essentially, we have so far in Shittas HaRishonim, we have both Shittas the Baal HaMor, the Shittas of Rabbeinu David, and Chasam Sofer establishes that that's Shittas HaTosfos, which Chasam Sofer wants to say Ledina is Shittas HaRamah, that the Chayva of Simcha on Shavuos that this Gemara is discussing is a Chiyuv D'Rabbanan. The Didan that we pass like a B'Shua, just to emphasize again, there certainly is the general Chayva Simcha on Yontif, which if that's Bizman Hazeh, is, as we're familiar, a broad machlokes rishonim of chayva simchas yontif bizman hazeh is the Raisa. But the additional degree of simcha which the Gra was mechayev on, or was noyagak upon him on Atzeres, that, according to these rishonim, is a din d'Rabbanan. So we have, in short, three possible approaches to the Gemara. That the din of simchas yontif hakol moedim Atzeres is because of the din of lochem. That Rebbe Lezer agrees that in yontif the din lochem doiraisa, the general chayv of simchas yontif is mechayev simchas yontif. We have it that it's a takana d'Rabbanan, or we have what Rameir shows from the Ramban in Chumash, that it's a chiyuv simcha d'oraisa, but is irrespective of simchas yontif, but it's a specific chiyuv because of simcha of Kabbalah Satayr. The shittas rishonim that we find that seems to imply that the chiyuv simcha on Atzeres is part and an aspect of lochem. That is is implied in the lashon of the Meiri, where the Meiri Kedarkoi comes to discuss what is the psak of the sugya. Do we paskin like Rebbe Lezer or do we paskin like Rebbe Shua? So Besoich Devar of the Meiri says that were the machlokes between Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua to be entirely in extremes, namely that Rebbe Lezer held there's no instance of simchas yontif which is mechayev lochem, and Rebbe Shua held that every yontif is mechayev lochem. Then the Meiri says we would have to paskin like Rebbe Shua. We wouldn't change the pashtus that the chayva simcha on yontif of lochem doesn't have any application because it can always be compensated for or replaced by limud HaTorah of Yosef V'Sheina. Says the Baal HaMor, but says the Meiri, but perhaps since we see that there are instances in which Rebbe Lezer concedes to Rebbe Shua that there's a chayva simchas yontif v'yedei achila b'shtiyah, so maybe then we should pass on like Rebbe Lezer because there are instances in which Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua are moeded to each other. Says the Meiri, nonetheless, we still pass on like Rebbe Shua. So we see from the Meiri that the Meiri is using Rebbe Eliezer's concession to Rebbe Shua of simchas yontiv in Atzeres through achila b'shtiyah as an instance that Rebbe Lezer concedes a case where the mitzvah of simchas yontiv is fulfilled through achila b'shtiyah. Let's focus on that for a moment. According to the way Rabbeinu David, the Meiri, and Tosfos, or the Ramban and Chumash, Rebbe Lezer, who says that on Atzeres one has to be oichel b'shoiseh, is not conceding to Rebbe Shua that this is an instance in which simchas yontif obligates achila b'shtiyah. That's not what he's saying. He's saying mitzad the din of simchas yontif, Shavuos is the same as everything else. What's mechayev simchas yontif? An additional chayva simcha because of yom shenitna by Torah, which is a takana d'Rabbanan or a din d'oraisa because Torah was nittan. Nothing to do with simchas yontif. It doesn't in any way create an area of overlap between Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua in their general principle of what constitutes simchas yontif, irrespective of that. So the Meiri could never bring that as an example of a case in which there's common ground between Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua b'negea to the din of simchas yontif. It's not true. According to the way the Baal HaMor, Rabbeinu David, and the Chasam Sofer and Tosfos, and the Ramban and Chumash understand what our Gemara is saying, our Gemara is not discussing Simchas Yontif. Our Gemara is discussing just an additional chiyuv to be someach, like the din of Achila on Erev Yom Kippurim, which is not din Simchas Yontif, according to many most Rishonim, din Achila. Memele says that it would be mavur from the Meiri, that the Meiri understood that the discussion of the Gemara was to establish that the din of hakomodim b'atzeres be'inu nami lochem requires simchas yontif, requires achila b'shtiyah. Now, time doesn't allow us to return to this to the extent that perhaps we would have wanted to, but this discussion in the Rishonim as to whether hakomodim b'atzeres be'inu nami lochem, this additional svara that chayva simcha of Atzeres becomes part of the mitzvah of simchas yontif, whether or not that can be created in svara, has an analogy in the dinim of Simcha on Sukkot, where the Briskirov, we'll just touch on this briefly, establishes in Yuma Kuntras that the din of Simchas Yom Tov, of Simchas Beis HaShoyeva, the enhanced Simcha Yisera that there was by Mikdash, is not related to Nisuch HaMayim, but is related to Simchas Yom Tov. Sukkot is mechayev an additional degree of Simcha, which expresses itself in Simchas Beis HaShoyeva, which isn't directly related to the She'iva. The Emek Bracha asks, where's the Makar in Torah that's true? Where do we see in Torah again that the Chayva Simcha of Sukkot is mechayev, that additional expression of Simcha through Simchas Beis HaShoyeva? So the Emek Bracha says that in absence of a Makar, and it's only a din d'Rabbanan. The Rambam didn't mean it to the Raisa. So we see again such an instance where the Rambam has that there is a tam to say, a reason to say, that Chayva Simchas Yom Tov on Sukkot should have a greater degree of expression and kiyum through Simchas Beis HaShoyeva, at least by Mikdash. But the Emek Bracha says, Al-Karcha, that can only be a din d'Rabbanan because it has no Makar in the Torah. This exactly echoes Rabbeinu David and the Balamor. That the Gemara that's saying possibly that Simchas Yom Tov requires a greater expression on Shavuos, and that should be a deraisa without a Makar in the pasuk. We can't say that. That's just an analogy where we find a similar discussion in Rabbi Seinu Achrein. The Sikum HaDvarim, therefore, we have three possible approaches to the sugya. We have the approach of the Meiri that Hakamoidin Batzeres Be'inon Ami Lachem is an aspect of the kiyum of Chayva Simchas Yom Tov Deraisa of Lachem. He brings that as an instance in which Rabbi Eliezer concedes to Bishua that Chayva Simchas Yom Tov is Mechayev Achila B'Shtiyah. We have the Mahalach of Rav Meir, based on the Ramban, that the Gemara also means a Chayva, a din Deraisa, but not of Simchas Yom Tov, but of a distinct and unique Mechayev of Simcha related to Kabbalah Satira. And the third Mahalach is what's Mavur and Taisus, according to the Chasam Sofer, in the Balamor and Rabbeinu David Mefurish, that since there's no Makar Midaraisa for this din of Hakamoidin that says Be'inon Ami Lachem, the Gemara brings no psukim, therefore this Al-Karchach is a Takana Derabana. The Nafkimina we've said, based on the Chasam Sofer, is can we be Mekel for the din, Chas v'Shalom, of Tanis Chaloim on Shavuos? Zot the Chasam Sofer, if the Chayva Simcha is a Deraisa, then Sofik Deraisa would be L'chumra, and we would have to be machma like those Rishonim that say that the enhanced Simchas Yom Tov on Shavuos disallows Tanis Chaloim. Masha'enken, if we say it's a D'Rabbanan, Zot the Chasam Sofer, then we can say Sofik D'Rabbanan L'Hokel and be maker like those Paiskim that would allow Tanis Chaloim on Shavuos. Says the Chasam Sofer, the omission by the Ramah of the Isser of Tanis Chaloim on Atzeres would imply that the Ramah was Machriya L'Hokel, and the basis of that Hachra L'Kula must be because our Gemara is a Din D'Rabbanan, using the principle of Heim Omru V'Heim. Rabbeinu David, V'Soich Dvarav, draws a parallel between the Chiyuv of Achila V'Shtiyah on Shavuos and the Chiyuv Achila V'Shtiyah on Erev Yom Kippur. Just go back briefly to his lashon. He says, "Ve'eino mara atzmoi someach," to show that one has joy in Kabbalah's Torah that is only possible to be demonstrated and to be manifest through achila v'shtiyah, ke'inyan, like we find. She'omru b'chi shel erev Yom Kippurim, like we find on erev Yom Kippurim. She'ha'oichel v'shoyse boi ma'alam alav ha'kosov kilu his'ane chi v'asiri. She'chayev hu liros atzmoi someach b'kaparas avinosav. Ben Yono and Shari Tshuva says that one of the reasons for the chiyuv of achila v'shtiyah on Erev Yom Kippurim is because one wants to demonstrate simcha. What's the simcha one's demonstrating on Erev Yom Kippurim? Because tomorrow one will receive kaparas aveinos. One will achieve kaparas aveinos. The joy of a yid reaching that stage of meriting kaparas aveinos fills him with simcha. What kind of expression does that simcha have to take? That necessitates achila v'shtiyah. Says Rabbeinu David, shebekachu meid al atzmai, because through that he demonstrates how much the aveira was of concern to him. Shu koyev aleim v'doeg aleim harbe, and he brings a raya from a medrash. What's the parallel which Rabbeinu David is drawing between Erev Yom Kippurim and Shavuos? He means the following. Erev Yom Kippurim is a deraisa. Shavuos, Rabbeinu David just said, was a derabbanan. The parallel he's drawing is that seemingly can be so many different ways of expressing simcha. Rebbe Lezer holds that if someone delights in limud HaTorah, it's a compensation for achila v'shtiyah. It's a replacement for it. So why is it that on the Yom Shenitna by Torah, where one demonstrates the simcha of Kabbalah HaTorah, does it have to only be manifest through achila v'shtiyah? Where do we see that? Zok Rabbeinu David, we see another instance in which a fundamental ruchniistic accomplishment floods a person with simcha to the extent that the only expression it can have is an achila v'shtiyah. Where's that? On Erev Yom Kippurim, where kaparas avonos floods the person with such simcha that midoiraisa it can only have its expression in achila v'shtiyah. So therefore, says the Rabbeinu David the Davar Nifla, the Chachamim drew on that din doiraisa, that the ruchnistic accomplishment of kaparas ovain, which demonstrates the daiga one has about ovain, requires achila v'shtiyah. Kol sheken kabbalas kol HaTorah kula. The greatest ruchnistic kinyan we ever can imagine is mechayev an expression through achila v'shtiyah. Davar Nifla, a margenisa that's in this Rabbeinu David. It's an entirely different perspective on how to understand why achila v'shtiyah of Atzeres is the expression for Kabbalah's Torah. One would have imagined the greatest expression of Kabbalah's Torah was to delight in Eisak HaTorah Alein. Says Rabbeinu David, the Torah teaches us that Madoch Kaporas Ovoin generates simcha which can only have its expression through achila v'shtiyah. Certainly, Kabbalah's Kol HaTorah Kula can only have its expression of simcha through achila v'shtiyah. One is a drabbanan, one's a deraisa, but Chachamim masmicha on achila v'erev Yom Kippurim. Dvarim niflan. So let's go. We'll see in a moment. Let's go a step further. This parallel between Erev Yom Kippurim and Atzeres is elaborated on by the Rekeach. The Rekeach HaGadol in Siman Reish Tzadikei in Hilchos Shavuos. We'll read out the Lashon because the Lashon is precious. He says, we only find that the tzibur brings shlomim on Shavuos. All other Yom Tovim, the karbanos, the musafim, are either oilos or chatois. Shlomim, there's something called shalmi tzibur. Zivchei shalmi tzibur. When a shalmi tzibur brought, dafka on Atzeres. So he says, al kein osur lis anois b'yom Atzeres. He says, if we want to find where in the Torah, the Rishonim ask, David the Balamor, where's the makor in Torah to this din that Atzeres is mechayev achila v'shtiyah? Zok the Rekeach, that's from the fact that the tzibur have to bring shalmei Atzeres. What's shalmei Atzeres? Shlomim is the korban, which is the korban that's nechal to the greatest extent. La gavoya, la bayalim, and la koyanim. Now it happens to be that shalmei Atzeres are not nechal by Kol Yisrael, but the idea that all of Klal Yisrael is bringing a carbon means that Klal Yisrael is bringing a carbon of Achiva. Therefore, says the Rekeach, that demonstrates that the essence of Shavuos is bound up with Achila v'shtiyah. And he brings our Gemara, and he says that that's the makar for our Gemara, that the Gemara says, Atzeres Yom Shenitna by Torah, therefore it requires Achila v'shtiyah. Al Kain Tzrichim Yisrael, says the Rekeach. Al Kain. Tzrichim Yisrael Lismayach. That's Mechayev Simcha on Yom Kippur, on Shavuos. Zot the Rekeach. Now we would expect the next words to be Shenitna by Torah. Zot the Rekeach, no. Shemoichel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avoneseim. Atzeres is a day of Mechilas Ovan. Where do we see that? He says, Da'aminu Ba'Yushalmi the Rosh Hashanah, familiar Yerushalmi. The Gemara says, brings a mem of a Meshashir B'Shem Ba'acha. B'kol HaKarbonos Ksiv Chatos, every one of the Musafim of the Regel contains a Chatos. U'ba'atzeres lo Ksiv Chatos, and Atzeres HaTorah doesn't mention it befurish, the Lashon of Chatos. Omer lem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, Mikivon shekibaltem oil HaTorah, as a result of being makabel ol Torah aleichem, mani aleichem ki'ilu lo chotosem yemechem. Niflon erekeach. Zod erekeach, yom shenitna by Torah is because it's a yom of mechilas oven. Yom shenitna by Torah isn't samech b'kabolas haTorah like Rashi and the other Rishonim say. Yom shenitna by Torah means because the opportunity to be makabel ol Torah generates mechilas oven. How do we know that mechilas oven is mechayiv simcha? Because the Erev Yom Kippurim is mechayiv simcha. Dover nifla, marginisa, that we find in the Rekeach. The Yom Shenina by Torah, the Rishonim ask, where's the Makar Deraisa for this? Says the Rekeach, similar to Rabbeinu David. Rabbeinu David says that Chachama will masnich l'chayva simcha on Achila and Shti on Erev Yom Kippurim. The Rekeach says it's the same din. And Vu steht das? Sayushalmi. And where did Yushalmi see it? Gzeres HaKosu. Because it doesn't mention Chatos and Atzeres. Why doesn't it mention Chatos? Because Kabbalah's old Torah is Ki'ilu lechatos amiyamechem. Mikivan shekibaltem ol Torah aleichem mani aleichem Ki'ilu lechatos amiyamechem. And he adds a diuk. We'll finish with this Be'ez Hashem. He adds a diuk. He says if one looks in the parshas throughout the entire parshas Hamoyados, if one looks through the entire parshas Hamoyados in Emor, the karbonas hayoim are not mentioned that they are l'reach nichayach. Torah alludes that it's the yom of karbonas. It's only in the oimer, karban oimer on second day Pesach, and the shtei halechem on Shavuos that the Torah says reach nichayach. Zot derikech, what's the reason for that? He says loimar to tell you that we would have thought because it's soirim, the carbon oimer, because it's only stoirim. Hoyisi oimer einem makabel reach nichayach. It's meichel behema. Lakein hutzrach by reach nichayach. And Memele, ha'atzeres, he says, ha'oichel lechem tsaru mayim lachatz lil moiteru l'kaim ha'mitzvahs reach nichayach mimor v'levayin. What's the reach nichayach of the shtei halechem? The reach nichayach of the shtei halechem is how much reach nichayach a person who devotes his life to limud HaTorah and is makabel ol Torah at the expense of relinquishing achila v'shtia, at the expense of relinquishing to be nimshach achatayva. How much reach nichayach that's going in the Rebbeinu Shalom?
Not in Shavuos.
Not in Shavuos. That's Simchat Yontif. What's the Rekeach here telling us? The Rekeach is saying that the yom of Kabbalah's Torah, a yom in which we bound ourselves to Kabbalah's oil Torah, to therefore be oisik b'Torah, even if it requires achila of lechem tzara mayim lachatz lomad, that creates the greatest reach nichayach for the Rebbeinu Shalom. The schus of that reach nichayach, that binding ourselves to Torah, creates a ki'ilu lechatos amiyamechem. Ki'ilu lechatos amiyamechem. And therefore the simcha of kaparas ovoin, that tahara that we get as a result of Kabbalah's old Torah, that's the mechayiv of simcha on the Yom Tov of Shavuos. We mentioned once in a previous limud the lashon of Rashi in Pesachim that later on this Amud, the Gemara that is almost, should we say, the mantra of the Yom Tov of Shavuos, where Rabbi Yosef said, "Ilav hayom kama Yosef iku b'shuka." Were it not for that day, how many other Yosefs would there be? What would make me different to any ordinary Yosef? Says Rashi, "Shalomadati Torah v'nisroi mamti." We explain based on the Nefesh HaChaim that the term nisroi mamti means I became transformed. To be mis'aleh means to be purified. To be misroimim means to be transformed. It means I became a different Metzias. Al Yedei Kabbalah's old Torah says the Rekeach from the Yushalmi Mali Aleichem Kilu Lechatos Yemechem. Why? Because I'm not the same person who was Chayte. Nisrimamti, I became something else. Nisrimamti. There's Kama Yosef B'Shukah, and I was one of them. And then I became something else, Nisrimamti. When a person is Rishoimim and becomes fundamentally transformed, he no longer has any association with his past. Like the Rambam says, Einani oisei ha'ish, tshuva accomplishes that. It's not me, it wasn't me. Here, without tshuva, Kabbalah's old Torah has a transformative effect. That the person can transform himself, he can transform his Oira Chaim. And if he transforms himself, then Mali Anechem Kilo Lechatos Yemechem. And if he transforms his Oira Chaim to dedicate himself to Limud HaTorah, he creates Reach Nichayach LaHashem. It's on Shavuos that the Torah says, besides on this Karban Oimer, Reach Nichayach LaHashem. This is the limud that the Rekeach gives us. And that is the Gzeres HaKosov, that extent of Simcha can be expressed, Dafka, Al Yidei Meichel U'Mishteh, and that says the Rekeach is the Mekor Do'iraisa of Hakol Moedin de Ba'atzeres Bo'Inon Lachem. Nifla. So we have from the Rishonim a number of perspectives now, fundamental approaches to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. We have what the Ramban is muvur, that Kabbalah Satorah itself is Mechayev Achilah B'Shtiyah. And the Makar of that Midiraisa is Vayoichlu Vayishtu and Ksiva Satorah Al Gabe Avon. Then we have a Margin Nisa on the Rekeach that the Makar is Achilah B'Shtiyah on Erev Yom Kippurim, because the transformation of Matan Torah is analogous to the transformation of Yom Kippurim. And then we have, of course, those shittas Rishonim that say that the Chachamim were Masakin in the Chiyuv. But to come back, and with this we'll finish, we'll come back to the Dvarim Nifloim of the Gra, something which we can aspire to and try to be Mekayim, as we, Be'ezer Hashem, Azaycha to Kabbalah Satorah, U'ma'id Somach Rabbeinu Zal, V'tigdolai HaSimcha Yoyse Mikol Regel, V'olaz Liboy B'Simchas Matan Torah. Means Hashem, we should together be Zaycha to Kabbalah Satorah Be'emes.